I'm seated in a very delightful room facing the mountains, and the scene is so peaceful. I hope my pronunciation of the Welsh city is right. Penrhyn Didreth. Oh no, even the clock sounds good to me. It sounds so natural. The clock, I hope it's not the clock of doom, but merely announces noon on this very lovely and peaceful Tuesday morning. I'm seated opposite the distinguished, the eminent British philosopher, Lord Bertrand Russell. And Lord Russell just seated here in front of the fireplace. The scene seems so peaceful, and yet the world outside seems so rife with tension, east, west, one accusing the other of being the villain of the piece and acclaiming himself the hero. And in recent months, and nay, in recent years, sir, you've been speaking out against what you call this insane drive toward universal destruction. As a result of this, Lord Russell, people have said you're one thing and another. What are you, sir? What do you believe in? Let me ask you a leading question, Lord Russell. On which side are you in this nuclear contest?
I'm not in either side. I think the contest is folly. And what I want is to get the contest to die down. It's like waves at sea after a great storm. Gradually the waves get less. And that's what I should like to see. But I'm not on either side. I think the whole contest is just a mistake.
You were speaking, Lord Russell, in one of your lectures on this very theme of the tensions facing the world today. You were saying East-West, namely the two large powers, Soviet Union on one side, the United States on the other, have so much in common. You were saying that 9/10 of the interests are identical. It is only in the matter of ideology that they differ, and it seems so ridiculous to you that both should...
I don't think ideology really plays any important part whatever. It's simply a thing dragged in to reinforce armaments. The differences between East and West are differences as to power, not differences as to ideology. There is very little difference between Russia and the United States. Each side thinks there's a great difference, but that's a mistake. There isn't much. It's not that. It's simply the question, who is to have power?
The question that arises, some will say, I'm sure some always say, but how can these differences be resolved? And really, war itself, people say, Cassandras will cry out, and they would put you in that category, Lord Russell, that the world will be destroyed, but not really. This has been said of other weapons before in other wars, and man has survived. What is your answer to that, sir?
Well, there's never been any weapon of the same sort, never. If there had been, it would have arisen earlier. But these new weapons have a destructive power that no weapons have had at any former time. And the existence of such weapons makes former strategies and former policies out of date. Because in old days you could have a war and one side might win, and the side that won didn't mind having wiped out the other side. But nowadays both sides get wiped out, and neither side will win in a war, and so the war has become silly. People have to say immoral, and I won't say it isn't immoral, but what I want to emphasize is that it's silly, because nobody is going to get out of it what he wants. Nobody.
Remember you were saying if there is a victor in this war, one side may end with more H-bombs, but neither side will end with living human beings. Remember that comment you had made? Well, Lord Russell, why do people, the great majority of people the world over, feel as helpless as they do? They feel as impotent as they do. This seems to be in the air, I'm sure, all over the world. The feeling that the individual, I, John Smith, John Doe, says, I can't do anything about it.
That's just a mistake. They can. I mean, an individual, if he has the pluck and the independence of mind, can do a very great deal. After all, here we sit, no organization, none whatever, and simply by expressing an opinion which is known to be unbiased, an individual can affect a very great deal, and this powerlessness of the individual is a form of cowardice. It's a pretense, an alibi for doing nothing.
This is interesting. This powerlessness, you think, is an alibi for doing nothing. Are you saying perhaps that inaction, not doing anything, is action in itself toward one's own death, I suppose?
Certainly, yes. I mean, if you saw some brutal man ill-treating a child, if you had enough physical power, you would certainly intervene. And if you don't intervene, you share some of his guilt.
The non-intervention. This, of course, I suppose was the case of the little man, the so-called little man in Germany, who says, what could I do? Would this be a parallel, perhaps, during the Nazi regime? He says, what could I do?
Well, it was very difficult under the Nazi regime, because that really was thoroughgoing, and it had its extermination chambers and so forth. I think if the government is sufficiently fierce, and was as fierce as the Nazis were, it is very difficult. But the existing governments are not quite at that level of wickedness.
Well, this being the case, the existing governors not at that level of wickedness, what specifically, I mean, the man who seems so alone and so helpless, and he certainly is not in danger of being arrested or having his door knocked down at 2 a.m. by some secret policeman. What then can he do specifically to make his feelings felt, as I'm sure most of the world feels war at this stage is insane?
Well, you see, there's not only one or two people who think this, there are a great many, and he ought to seek out the people who think as he does, join organizations, and make his feelings and the feelings of those who agree with him known. It's difficult because the press is against you. Broadly speaking, the press of the world is determined to act in ways that will involve the extermination of mankind. And that's because they're stupid. Just stupid. Because they don't seem to realize that dividends are not paid to corpses.
I think, Lord Russell, if I follow you correctly, and I think I do, is that it's not a question of evil men at work right now as foolish men at work. I mean, silly men.
Silly men, yes.
The fact is that the world is different than it was generations ago, that a new form of destruction has been invented, and you're inferring then there is no winner, there will be no victor. Were there a battle between the powers, you're inferring there will be no victor.
No, there'll be no victory at all. If we had a big nuclear war now, with Russia and America the main combatants, well, probably a very large percentage of the populations of Russia and America would be wiped out. The whole population of Western Europe and Britain, without exception. The survivors would be ill, hungry, miserable, and savage. And it would take ages and ages for the descendants of these survivors, of whom a very large percentage would be idiots or monsters, for the descendants of these people to build up anything again at all. And during all that time there would be horror, ghastliness, misery, and all that is simply because the people of our time couldn't see that agreement is better.
Well, this leads us to a subject of another group of men, Lord Russell, men who are brilliant, who in a sense have this is the age of the scientific revolution, or refer to the scientists themselves. Now, the whole history of science has been a history of enlightenment. The men of science have always been enlightened men on the side of human values, haven't they, by and large, Lord Russell? The men of science.
Well, I suppose by and large they have, But there have been very important exceptions, and there are very important exceptions in the present day. A great many men of science have played a very honourable role in trying to prevent the harm that threatens through nuclear weapons. But there have been, I regret to say, a fair number of men of science who have been willing to sell their services to governments and tell the lies that brought in an income.
Well, suppose a scientist says, it is my job to offer you knowledge, this new discovery I've made. How this knowledge is used by mankind is none of my concern. How do you answer that scientist?
I tell the man he's just making a silly mistake. How can he say it's none of his concern? If you see a homicidal maniac and you give him a revolver, are you not responsible for the people that he kills with it? Of course you are. And so, similarly, these men of science who've given the world something very much bigger than a revolver they share responsibility for what is done with it. They can't wash their hands of politics and say, oh no, that's not my concern. That's just a form of lazy cowardice.
Maybe you point out a notable case of a scientist who would not allow his work to be used for destruction. During the Crimean War, I believe in one of your lectures, you mentioned Faraday, who refused to work on poison gas. Yeah. He said it's feasible, but he refused to do it.
Well, that was very creditable to Faraday. But, of course, the Crimean War was not very important, and anyway, we won it without the help of poison gas. And so, although it's thoroughly creditable to Faraday, there wasn't a government that was inclined to put pressure upon him. And it wasn't as difficult for him as it is now. But I don't think scientists ought to shrink from a thing because it's difficult.
Lord Russell, of course, I'm always asking the case. There are young scientists, I'm sure, in all countries who love their wives and children, listen to good music, love their Mozart and Beethoven, read good books, perhaps even read early writings of Bertrand Russell, who work for their governments on, and they may not know exactly this, they know the precise work they are doing, but the overall result of it is something that might destroy the human race, or a large portion of it. Now, this is a dilemma in which this young man finds himself. How would you answer him?
I should say, in the world in which we are living now, any scientist who works for any government shares responsibility for mass murder and is a man who cannot be tolerated by decent folk.
Lord Russell, there are a great many young people who admire you very much. They march, they sit down, and I think of some early BBC talk that you gave that was heard over our station in Chicago, why you liked Turgenev. And you said because he dealt with eager young people, a society of eager young people whom one could easily grow to love if one knew them. Would you say it's their equivalents who are with you during these days?
Well, there are a great many young people who are with me. You see, I think it's natural enough. People on the threshold of life are more anxious to live than old people. Look at me, I'm 90. Well, I haven't much expectation anyhow. To me personally, it doesn't much matter whether there's a nuclear war or not. In the course of nature, I shall die about the time that it happens. So that it doesn't very much matter to me personally. And the young people don't feel like that. They have their life ahead of them. They want to be allowed to live it. And they don't want these elderly ruffians to come and say, no, we'll wipe you out just to please us so that we may win the next election. They don't want that, and I think that's very natural in the young and very praiseworthy.
Were you the one who described these elderly ones as overage destroyers? I think I've heard that phrase used. Well, Lord Russell, assume that a madman does not push a button. A madman on either side does not push a button, which leads to another subject. You spoke of the dangers with the arsenals being built up. Sometimes it might be a local figure, a captain or an admiral, or it could be a lieutenant, since I guess the military men on both sides have been trained to carry these weapons. It's possible there could be a mistake on some equipment, couldn't there? And then without any preconceived idea of the end may begin. This too is a possibility, isn't it?
Oh yes, there are a great many possibilities of war beginning by accident. A great many. It might, well, of course, as you know, the radar observers for the United States mistook the moon for a flight of Soviet vessels. And nevertheless, they said, oh yes, radar's quite reliable, oh yes. And over and over again, they've mistaken a flight of geese for a flight of Soviet weapons. There are all those things. There's also the possibility that you were mentioning of some local fanatic, captain in Polaris. He might very easily brood and brood until he went mad. It's not at all unlikely, that's one thing. But, of course, there is also the deliberate thing. The Cuba crisis was just an example of that. The deliberate action of the two main powers was bringing the world to the very verge of a war. And I think we ought to give Khrushchev the credit that we're still alive. It is due to Khrushchev personally that you and I are here talking and still alive. But for his rather wise action in withdrawing at the last moment, which would have been wiser if it had been earlier, but still it's very wise to have done it at any stage. But for his personal determination to withdraw, you and I would be dead, and everybody else would too. And I think for that reason we ought to give him credit, which has nothing to do with the merits of communism, nothing whatever. It's a personal thing, that.
Oh, perhaps some might. I should point this out. When I tried to reach you over the phone from London the other day, and the operator heard the part of the message, he's saying to me, "Oh, you're one of them ban the bomb boys, eh?" I said that wasn't my interest at this moment, though I'm very sympathetic with Lord Russell. I should like to reach him because he's a celebrated figure in our world. This is part of my job. But her comment, by the way, was not a hostile one or unkind one, merely a quizzical one. And so a great many people are merely wondering. They would use the phrase fanatic, Oh, them little fanatics who walk along the road, see. How would you answer them when they say, well, Lord Russell is with fanatical young people, or at this moment he's fanatical on the subject? This phrase is used now and then, you hear. How do you reply to that?
Just to wait for time to persuade them. Everybody who's ever stood for anything that was any good whatever has been accused of being a fanatic. And that's just, it's an occupational hazard, you might say. You just have to live it down. And I think that a very great many, certainly among the young, do not regard me as a fanatic, because, oddly enough, they think they'd rather be alive than dead.
I wonder why. Lord Russell, this leads us to the subject of the man, the thoughtful man at a certain time when tensions are high and headlines are wild. You said somewhere, and I know you, as a young boy, later on you became disenchanted with Ibsen, but in Enemy of the People, one man can be right and a whole group can be wrong, and you have said it on occasion. The minority, at one time, and so many times, is right, and eventually what he says turns out to be true.
Well, that is so. You'll find all advances that have been of any importance have been initially made by a very small minority, perhaps one only, and have gradually spread. And the man who makes any advance that is really beneficial to humanity is always persecuted by humanity. And it's a law of history.
A law of history that would be applicable to today, I suppose. Since on the subject of, this is not unrelated, Lord Russell, the situation today and the lectures you gave on books that influenced your youth, because what you read and what you are certainly determines the very things you do at this moment. You were speaking of Gibbon once, and why he impressed you. In Gibbon, you saw a stately historical procession, And even Gibbon, you recognize that cultural values at one time or another survive, even the inroads of barbarism. But this, you assume, could not happen today if the bomb were ever to fall. All would go then, would it not?
Well, I'm afraid so. You see, if you try to think of the conditions of life for the few survivors after a nuclear war, you will see that they are really very, very desperate indeed. The food that they would naturally eat will be poisoned. It will be all, you mustn't eat it. You could only eat very, very special food. The lines of communication will be all destroyed, so that you depend on local food. You won't be able to import it. The people will be all in a state of hysteria because of the dreadful experience they've gone through. The children will be very largely idiots or monsters, and no good at all. And the future of such a collection of, well, they'd all be small bands of roving brigands who would have to steal the food from each other because there wouldn't be enough. And I don't see much that's good coming out of that.
Assume then, Lord Russell, governments find or recover their sanity. Assume this. There are ideas you have, you wrote somewhere, the world in which you would like to live. And you spoke of 3 requisites for a stable world, as I remember.
Yes.
Do you remember what those were?
Yes, well, the first requisite, I think, for a really stable world, the first requisite is a world government with a monopoly of all the major weapons of war, so that nobody could hope to fight against it. That's the first requisite. The next requisite is a great diminution of fanaticism, that people should cease to hold the view that was held by the Inquisition, and is still held by the great majority of mankind, that a person who doesn't agree with me ought to be exterminated. That is the general view nowadays, and that would have to change, and that's rather difficult. I think there would have to be a certain economic equality throughout the world, because if one part of the world is rich and another poor, the poor part will envy the rich part will be frightened of that envy, and you will get the sort of tension that builds up to war. So that I think there would have to be a raising of the level of the underdeveloped countries. Ultimately, everybody should be at least as well off as people are in the United States. Those are the main requisites for a stable world.
I think, too, you mentioned some way of stemming the population explosion. That, yes, too, I suppose.
Well, of course, that's quite necessary, because with the improvement of medicine, infants don't die in sufficient numbers. In old days, the world was kept going by the deaths of infants. If you had a family of 10, you were very lucky if 3 survived. Well, that's no longer the case. And therefore you have to see that there are not too many infants. That is certainly an important condition of stability. But that I confidently expect to see happen if there isn't a nuclear war.
And so assume then there is no war. That is, we are saying there's a tremendous job ahead. Is it not? Half the world, I believe, is underfed. Is it not today?
No, more than half. Yes, 2/3.
This, then, I suppose, could be one of the projects. I mean, science, then. Science can be devoted.
You see, look, what people are like. You go to people in the United States and you say to them, or go to people in this country and you say to them, 2/3 of the world are undernourished. Now, if we didn't spend our time on nuclear weapons, we could nourish these people. Oh, yes, they say, what of them? They're only black men or something. Doesn't matter about them. And consequently, you know, everybody is surprised to find that these undernourished people don't love them.
So then, the way to win, if not love, certainly respect might be some slight change in attitude.
Yes, I think so. Well, if you could only get people interested in the welfare of others and not interested in power, it's this lust for power that is at the root of the trouble.
Remember, you pointed out some hypothetical case. If this lust for power could in some way or other be eliminated, you were saying, assume mad dogs ran about in Berlin today, an epidemic of rabies broke out, how both sides would be working together to eliminate this epidemic.
Well, they certainly would. They wouldn't stop about politics. I worked it out rather, that because you might say, oh, well, I hope the mad dogs will bite more people on the other side than on our side. But I don't think that is what would happen, no. Only it does happen with the politicians. The politicians do bite more people on one side than on the other. And they're really politicians just like mad dogs.
Lord Russell, well, is there a way of reaching politicians, euphemistically called statesmen these days?
You only reach them through the general public. First you have to convert the general public, and then the politicians will of course follow suit, because all they want is to get re-elected.
First you have to convert the general public, and this leads us to this dilemma again, don't we? Mass communications being what they are, and most of the press the world over, on each side representing more or less the establishment position. How can the mass of the population be reached then?
Well, aren't we reaching it at this moment? I think the answer is that you have to behave in some manner which interests people and they want to know about it. And however the mass media are against you, if you know how to behave in a manner that excites people's interest, you can overcome that barrier. It's a difficult problem. That was why we took to civil disobedience. We thought this was a means of overcoming this barrier. And on the whole, we do get more or less known. I mean, there are a great many people who know that there is such a movement, and there are even some who know why. And I think in the course of time, if we're given time, we should be able to do it. But because it's a race against destruction, because at any moment the whole world may be wiped out. But if it isn't wiped out, we shall in time manage it.
Well, Lord Russell, suppose some people say to you, I don't want to violate the law or some ordinance. See, when you civilly disobey, they'll say you are a violator of the law. How would you answer that, sir?
Well, I should say, now look here, my dear fellow, have you ever read any history? Have you ever heard of the early Christians? Did they obey the law? They were told to worship the emperor, and they said they wouldn't. And so they suffered. Have you ever heard of anything of value in the world that has been done without somebody violating the law? Galileo violated the law. He said the earth moved, and the law said it didn't. And so he was duly punished. And you'll find that everybody who's made any advance has had to violate the law at some time. The law represents what people thought right some time ago, because it takes time to enact a law. And when circumstances change, what was right ceases to be.
Lord Russell, what is the kind of world you would like to live in? You've written of this, the kind of world you would like to live in.
The world I should like to live in would be a very nice world, but alas, I don't know how to make it. I should like to live in a world where children were brought up as far as possible freely, so that they shouldn't be filled with rebellious impulses, but should be happy and friendly. I should like to live in a world where those of men's impulses which are not possessive would have free scope and all sorts of encouragement. You know, I divide impulses into possessive and creative. If you write a poem, you don't prevent another man from writing a poem. If you eat food, you do prevent him from eating that food. And so if there's a shortage of food, you get conflicts between people. So you must have the material comforts sufficiently supplied. But what happens always in all societies that have ever existed is that the creative impulses are cramped by politicians or by churches or by something like that. That the man who has an important new idea or a man who has an important new way of feeling is punished for it, although that would be a solution of a great many of our troubles. Now I should like creative impulses free and encouraged. And I should like we spoke of power a moment ago. I should like the power impulses to go into creation. That if you could write poetry, you should write poetry. If you could compose music, you should compose music. That, or in lesser ways, everybody, he can make a beautiful garden. There's always something creative a person can do. And I should like their energies directed in those ways and not to thwarting the rest of mankind.
Is this world, Lord Russell, possible in our time, would you say? The world in which creativity is free?
I think hardly in our time, no. I think we can move towards it. You see, it's a matter of degree. I mean, on the whole, in some ways things are better than they used to be. People used to be burnt alive, and now they're only slowly starved, which I suppose is slightly better, but I don't know. And you can take steps. You can't get very far in our world because we're such a lot to do.
Lord Russell, I remember I was about to ask you a question at the very beginning. It dealt with your speaking of books that influenced your youth, and you spoke on one of the BBC broadcasts that we heard of Shelley, and you liked Shelley for several reasons. At the time when you were young, I think you were somewhere between the ages of 15 and 21 when you had read these books that you talked about.
Yeah.
And you spoke of this being a formative period in your life.
Well, yes, because I was getting to know the great literatures of the world, and it is rather an exciting, new vistas perpetually opening before you. And certainly I liked Shelley because he had a vision of what the world might be. And I still like him for that, though, of course, it's a much more difficult matter getting there than he thought it was. He thought the kings in the Holy Alliance were the obstacle, and if they were got out of the way, the world would be happy. Well, they're all dead now, but we're not happy.
I remember this, I read, sir, Lord Russell, in this stanza of yours: "The world's great age begins anew, the golden years return, the earth doth like a snake renew her winter weeds outworn. Heaven smiles, and faiths and empires gleam like wrecks of a dissolving dream." And you speak of this apocalyptic hope of Shelley. Do you still feel this today?
Well, yes, it's a hope. It's grown rather distant. I mean, I think we're a long way from it, but it remains a hope. It's what human life could be, and I think in gloomy moments it's a good thing to reflect. What a glorious and splendid and happy and wonderful thing human life could be if only human beings would let it.
If only human beings would let it. And again, I think of one radio broadcast of yours: "If only human beings could forget all else but their humanity." I think you said that. To forget all the trivia that separates them.
Yes, I said remember your humanity and forget the rest. And by the rest I meant their reasons for hating other human beings.
Lord Russell, anything else that you would care to say? I know we merely, during this hour or less, scratched the surface of your thoughts on today, yesterday, and man and his dilemma today. Anything you'd care to say that we haven't discussed thus far or talked about?
Well, I should just like to say this in general. that I admire in the present world those men that I think are doing their best to lead the world away from war. And those are sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other. This fixed conviction on both sides that only their side wants to avoid war. This is a delusion. But I will admire a communist who does what Khrushchev did in the Cuba crisis. I will admire a man on our side who does any similar thing. I don't think that people should be judged by their ideology. They should be judged by their attitude to the imminent peril of disaster which faces us all because we are bigoted, because we are filled with hatred of other ideologies, because we cannot remember that after all, the humanity which we share controls most of our interests, and the immense majority of the interests of East and West are exactly identical. And if we could remember that, we might perhaps be a little less unwise, a little less destructive in our public policies.
Lord Russell, Bertrand Russell, thank you very much. Lord Russell, you were saying, as you're poking the fire now, let you poke that fire. Ain't that cool? It's warm inside here. Lord Russell, you were speaking of Penryn Dydreth. You better get that big chunk of coal first. I think I'll describe, Lord Russell, stoking the fire. There's a huge chunk of coal that you're putting in. This is sort of like a sports commentary. at your putting into the fireplace, I notice there's a certain design and you're doing it, almost architectural in fashion. And it's there's one tough piece of coal that's making it. The phrase itself, the city you live, Penryn Dydreth, Lord Russell. Penryn Dydreth. It's a tough phrase and for me to say. What does that mean roughly, basically?
I believe it means the green hill between two estuaries, but I can't vouch for that exactly.
Why have you chosen this particular locale for a specific reason, this place?
Oh, I like North Wales. I've known North Wales since I was a boy, and I like the scenery here, and I have some friends who live in the immediate neighborhood, and on the whole it seemed nice, and I found this house rather pleasant, so I settled here.
One question I want to ask about Wales, North Wales, Lord Russell. It's now close to December. There's so much green. Is it green all year round?
Oh, yes, there's very, very little frost or snow here. You see, it's a sea climate.
Beautiful. It's a lovely view. So that's what that is, an estuary. Now I know. Thank you very much. Run will come. It's now a couple of hours after the Russell interview. We feel pretty good about things at the moment. Feel good that we met Lord Russell and have him on tape. But I doubt very much whether this could have been swung without the help of Phyllis Evans, Mrs. Merritt Evans, who drove us through just about the most beautiful countryside I've seen in a long time. And it's, as Bertrand Russell said, yes, green almost all the year round, yet there were some brick-colored foliage around too, and saw the slate and where the quarrymen worked. And that's rough, but the verdure of nature is still intact. Well, Phyllis, many things to ask you about. You, an American, living in Wales with Merritt and your daughter. Your feelings? You pretty much are Welsh in feeling now?
Oh, no. I'm I'm that curious combination. I really have a foot in both camps. I realize Wales' problems, and I love Wales, and I do anything that I can to help the cause of the language and to help the country as a country. But I don't think any American woman particularly can ever be anything but an American.
Well, while you're here right now, before we catch that train that takes us back to London, a couple of questions about living in Wales or in this United Kingdom. And one of the big points that I told you about Mary Papyrus, the waitress from London, I interviewed and at her house with the 4 kids, and she was marvelous, but she had this one bone to pick with a particular doctor who seemed to be a martinet, and the impression she might have given is that national health is not working. It wasn't that. She was merely saying she had trouble with this doctor, and he was just a louse, you know. But you have lived in America, and now you live in Wales. In one case, there is a doctor. There is no national health as we know it here. Now, in Wales, there is national health. What have you found out to be the difference?
Well, I think that the basic difference is that the national health in this country is rightly termed national insurance. And that's exactly what it is. It is an insurance for people who live here, that their life savings won't be wiped out by a serious illness of any member of the family. And as far as actual medical care is concerned, the doctor we had when we lived in Massachusetts, I doubt if there's a better doctor in the whole of the world. I don't think he could be approached anywhere. He was marvelous. But you come to Bangor, and a city like Bangor, anywhere, whether it's
Say Bangor, Wales, rather than Maine.
Wales,
But go ahead.
yeah. A city like Bangor, Wales, anywhere, whether it's in the United States or in Britain, you're going to have a limited choice of doctors. And you must pick the best out of this limited choice. And you are allowed to pick your own doctor. There is no question of your being assigned to some guy. You can pick which one you want. And that's exactly what we did. We took about 2 months after we came here. We polled our friends and said, "Who's your doctor? What do you think of him?" And we found the one that we thought would suit us best. And he's marvelous. Anything that needs to be done, he comes out in the middle of the night if that's necessary. He comes to the house if we're not well enough to come to the surgery. And all prescriptions, we pay for prescriptions, but we pay a standard price, 2 shillings, which would be a little tiny bit more than about 25 cents. And that includes whether we want aspirin on prescription or whether we want the most expensive antibiotics, or whether he chooses to prescribe them for us. Likewise, when Lynyd a few months ago...
Your 13-year-old daughter.
Yeah, our 13-year-old daughter, a few months ago, we thought she had appendicitis, and they had her in and out of hospital examining her, and took x-rays and found out it wasn't appendicitis, it was a spastic colon, which could be assumed to be appendicitis by the symptoms. Well, whisking her in and out of hospital and all these exploratory doohickeys and all the x-rays would have cost us a small fortune in America, because they didn't operate. If they'd operated, we could have got it on Blue Shield. But since they didn't operate, we would have paid through the nose. But we didn't pay a penny. Likewise, when I had to get my glasses changed, you pay a fixed fee for your glasses, and that's that. I think it's something like half of what they actually cost. So that when I say insurance, this to me is a very real thing. I don't have to worry at all. If Mairead should fall sick tomorrow and be out of work for 6 months, well, this would be a dreadful thing personally, but it wouldn't take every penny we've got in the bank.
Then I'm thinking about national health and its effect upon people. Does it take away your choice of a doctor? We're told, in America that if the medical plan that was proposed by the administration was defeated, were to go into effect, initiative would be destroyed. That is, would you have a right to choose your own doctor?
Oh,
Do you do it?
absolutely. Absolutely. The only limitation on choice would be the same limitation you have in the United States, geographical, physical limitation. Obviously, you aren't going to choose, if you live in Wales, you aren't going to choose a doctor who's in London because he won't be able to come out on night calls. But if you lived in New York, you wouldn't choose a doctor in Chicago either. You would choose a doctor in your area who'd be able to get to you within, say, 20, 30 minutes. And I have a friend living in Menai Bridge. Now, she doesn't like any of the...
Menai Bridge is where you live in Wales.
That's right, little tiny village. There are 2 doctors there. She doesn't happen to care for either of them, so she's booked with a doctor in Beaumaris, which is 4 miles away. My doctor is in Bangor, which is 2 miles.
National insurance, both cases.
Absolutely.
How do the doctor? Any idea how the doctors feel about it here in England?
Actually, I talked to them in 1948 when the plan first went in, then when I was back in 1955, and then when I came back this time, 1960. And it's quite fascinating because in 48, I would say that probably the majority of the medical association did not want to go in. It was sort of a fait accompli by the government. By 1955, when I came back, the tide had changed completely. Doctors that I had talked to before who said this will never work, it will be abused, and so on, had found that the abuses were in the early months, and they were largely people who had neglected to have things done for years because they couldn't afford it. For example, the butcher in our village in Harlech, when I first went to Harlech, did not have one sound tooth in his head. He was the most revolting sight I've ever seen, all rotten stumps. Medical health came in 2 years later. He had a beautiful set of false teeth, but he was actually too poor to pay for them himself. It was a small village, and he just had subsistence, and that was all.
Got this free?
And he got this free. Now, Mered's mother, back in the old days when, they had nothing per week and 11 kids to bring up on nothing per week, she couldn't afford to go and have spectacles prescribed. You know what she did? And everybody of her class did. They went to Woolworths, and they have a counter of glasses on Woolworths, and she just picked up one after another until she found a pair that she thought made her see better, and she wore those. It's a wonder she isn't blind. But she couldn't have afforded the doctor's bill for examination, and she couldn't have afforded the spectacles. When Mered went off to college, this is how little money there was. When he went off to college, he went with his mother's life savings in his pocket, which was £6, which is about $18. And she was a very frugal woman.
And so now she has the glasses she wears now are free.
Absolutely, yes.
What's this? Well, this is a superfluous question of you what you said, but the Evans family budget before and after,
Well, yes, we kept a budget in America, and of course, what happens now is this. We pay per week, National health isn't free, as people say it is. We have little insurance cards, they're called, which are stamped every week by your employer, and that is taken, a percentage of it is taken out of your salary, a small percentage. I think it amounts to, less than $3 a week, but that's taken out, and your employer pays a similar amount, and the government pays more as well. It's subsidized. But this means that we are paying per week. Now, what would happen in America was that, being young and full of beans, we thought, we were immortal and would never get ill. And then all of a sudden, bing, like that, I had to have a major operation when we were in Boston. And I had Blue Cross and Blue Shield at the time, but although it covered all my hospital bills, it did not cover the surgeon completely. I had to pay $250 on top of what Blue Cross and Blue Shield covered. Plus, after I got home, I was on a medication for a year, and that medication was very expensive, and that, of course, was not covered by the medical plan, so that when we got hit hard.
Well, then, some other... The Bangor, Wales to London train, change it crew, will be coming by in about 5 minutes. We're sitting in the refreshment room of the depot right now. And, what is it? It's just about 20 to 4, 7 minutes. So Phyllis Evans, as we're seated here and you're seeing us off at the train, you talked about national health. In 5 minutes, the state of women in Wales. Now, I'm thinking Clancy Siegel, the writer, was saying that women of England seem more placid, seem to accept the secondary status more placidly than do the American women. The women of Wales, you have been, you're an American girl, and now you're a Welsh housewife.
Well, I would agree with him completely. There is much more placidity. I think part of this
More
is
placidity where?
Here in
Wales.
this country, in Wales, yes. Wales is frequently referred to as a matriarchal society, as some people say America is. The mother is apparently the subsidiary figure, and in, let's say, 20, 30 years ago, the occupations were very well defined. The father went out to work and made the living, and the mother did everything to do in the house and the children, which meant bringing in the coal, polishing her husband's shoes before he went to work, that sort of thing. My husband never polished his own shoes until he was married. And I flatly said that as a jolly good American, I wasn't going to polish his shoes.
You retrained him.
Well, between us, we got him retrained. But I think I've been thinking a lot about this business of the difference, and I think a good part of it is education. I know there have been a lot of things said about the American educational system. There's been a lot of re-examining of the American system. They say we don't specialize enough, we don't work our kids hard enough, and so on. But one thing I've noticed since I've been back here, and this is a tremendous difference, 25% of our high school kids go on to further education, university or college. Now, in this country, in Wales, in Great Britain as a whole, 5% go on to further education. And in general, those will tend to be boys rather than girls. If you have a family with a boy and a girl, a daughter and a son, and let's say the daughter is much more able than the son will nevertheless be the one to get the university education. They'll send him to cram school if necessary to get him through so that he will have the degree so that he can get the better job, whereas in actual fact the daughter has the brains of the two. I have friends who are in exactly that position, and I think that because they don't take education for women, or haven't in the past taken education for women seriously enough, you have a group of women who don't develop any strong opinions of their own on anything except housework and children. They are acknowledged to be supreme on how to keep the house going and how to budget for the food and so on. But most of my friends, and now this is 1962, most of my friends in the 20 to 40 age group do not. In fact, I am the only woman I know who has a joint checking account with her husband. The rest of them, the husband has the checking account, and he gives the wife so much per week as a housekeeping allowance. And in general, I mean, she takes what he gives her. And if she wants something to spend on herself, something she considers essential, but he doesn't, well, then she has to save it out of the housekeeping. So that she is still being treated a little bit as a chattel, a child who, isn't quite mature enough to understand these things.
So there is no difference then, you say, between Wales and England as far as the status. Basically, it's the same.
Basically the same, yes.
Then when it comes, of course, I wonder just how much of a difference there is between this and America. I don't mean this matter of difference of opinion. This becomes a personal matter, doesn't it? I mean, difference of opinion as to world outlook or matters sociological. This is individual, I think, all over the world.
But one of the things that, you see, this coming back to this business about education, in general, the British woman will vote as her husband votes. Now, this is not
I think this is
absolute.
basically so in America, too, with exceptions. Don't you think so?
Well, again, I'm talking now about the 25% who are the so-called educated classes. you get there, and she may very well vote as her husband does because she is apt to choose a man whose ideals are the same as hers.
Oh, now this point, apt to choose a man whose ideals are the same as hers. Doesn't the Welsh woman have that particular choice?
It's oddly enough far more limited here. You are very apt to find a university man who will marry a nurse or a clerk or someone like that. In other words, he will have had a university education and she will not. So that instead of discussing with him and making up her mind, she does what he tells her.
This is our train. Phyllis, thank you very much for everything. Some several hours later now, back in the London hotel room, might be as good a time as any to take some inventory of much of what's happened thus far. I suppose the first thing to do would be to describe Bertrand Russell, a delicate, small-boned, charming, gracious man, laughs a good deal, seems to have still retains a good sense of humor. And one of the ladies tried to open one of the windows to let the dog in. It seemed that Lord Russell's dog was sort of scratching at the door, trying to get in. Russell wouldn't let her open the window. He insisted opening it himself, one of those high French windows, and he did it without any difficulty. In fact, the 90 years didn't show at all. Well, hardly at all. He insisted on raking the fire himself. One time difficulty in getting up out of the chair suddenly, but that's about the only time his age really showed, but his charm all the time and his ease. I was much surprised at the smallness of his size, but primarily he's almost as China doll in build, I'd say.
Very erect.
Very erect is the word from another quarter of this room. Certainly that. As far as the Wales trip is concerned, the trip by automobile from Penryn Daidrath to Bangor was the scene of probably the most beautiful rolling landscape I've ever seen. Green was certainly the dominant color. At times there was some autumnal brown, but way up on the distant peaks was some bits of snow to be seen, but that's about the only sign that winter is here or close to the winter season. I guess, too, as far as Wales is concerned, taken with a kind of contrast between the tall mounds of slate here with the quarries. That you saw, cast o'er with a sickly hue. And that seemed the only non-natural part of the landscape, and it seemed too ill. The small fences, the small walls, stone, all stone, and built without cement, seemed to have been put together in a jigsaw manner, and this principle followed down through the ages, and all seemed to be part of one architectural design, too. There were small pasture lands surrounded by these similar stone fences, stone walls, and apparently the law of primogeniture was never practiced in Wales, and so all the sons equally inherited the father's estate, and thus it is these small pasture lands, sheep all over the place, 1 or 2 rams. The mountains, tall, didn't realize how tall the peaks were in Wales. Told here that the Mount Everest climbers often do their practicing in these regions, and quite a number of casualties each year. The mountains look pretty fierce. About London, England, smoking as much as ever, it seems, despite the administrations, the government's posters all over the place, and very effective and graphic posters they are too, about the ills caused by cigarettes, but nonetheless the cigarettes are being puffed away, it seems almost perversely, by the London citizenry. and cigarettes, incidentally, are much more expensive than they are in America. The one thing you find easy to ride are the subways. They call them the tubes here. The tubes. And even I have no difficulty. Everything seems to be so well planned. You're directed to a certain track. You know what train is coming. It's listed. Next train, the train to be coming. The where you are, signs of that all over the place. And each subway train or tube train has a diagram on the wall which you can look at, and you see where your station is 3 stops from now, 4 stops from now. I mean, I haven't gone wrong yet, and if I haven't gone wrong, boy, then anybody can ride the tube. The taxi cabs are very good to ride, and they seem like old-fashioned limousines. The cab rates are much, much less than they are in Chicago, and each of the cab drivers seems, well, with a few exceptions, they're very staid, middle-aged guys, some young guys too, from the East End of London, as you can tell from the dialect, who are driving the cabs too, and they're very informative. I think they all seem to know the streets. They don't carry any directories with them. Now and then they tend to get lost, especially if you talk to them, as I have a tendency to do. They like to talk, but you run the risk of they getting lost, and this has happened several times. On the subject of Wales again, perhaps didn't accentuate enough the fact that there's a contrast between the mountains and the valleys, and you couldn't help but think of the Llewellyn novel, How Green Was My Valley. There was a road driven along the distance, a road along the mountainside, and this was the old Roman road. They call it Whatley Avenue now, a street, Whatley Avenue along the mountainside. But as you thought of this old Roman road, you couldn't help but think of what those soldiers must have thought, too, coming from a sunny clime to Wales, perhaps during some inclement weather that we're not having now. And indeed, they must have cursed the weather, their fate, and their generals. Some Roman private, some Roman GI at the time. You see that road he walked. Oh, I have to tell you about tea time. That must be described. Well, in the case of Ivy Compton Burnett, it was understood, even though we came at 4, that there would be some time out. So as I sat talking to this little old lady in the Charlotte Bronte-like flat of hers with these tall ceilings way up and a mirror high against the wall and somewhat dimly lit, the fireplace half glowing, you had the feeling you were in the home of Jane Eyre. And there she's looking at you like a very alert-eyed little mouse, asking questions, looking about. And then she says, "Didn't you hear the bell?" I said, "No, I didn't hear any bell." "Didn't you hear the bell?" "No, I didn't hear the bell." And then the little bell tinkled. The lady had tea ready, and there's Miss Compton Burnett serving the tea, the little cozy covering to keep it warm. And then it comes in various phases there. She was serving bread and jam, and then came the ginger cake, and you get pretty filled up with it, because supper is later, sometime about 8 o'clock, I guess, in London. Must tell you about tea, though, on the train. See, it says tea, so you think you're going to go for a cup of tea. You think, well, why not? And then there's the tea, and then there are the little half sandwiches that are served, you see. Then he comes around again, the steward, and you're still drinking the tea, and you finished the little lady finger style sandwiches, and he comes along with tea cakes. That's something else, with jam of variety. And you finish the tea cakes, you say, well, that's it. You just finished the tea. He comes along with bread and jam. You finish the bread and jam, you're about to get up, he comes along with biscuits. Or it could be a ginger cake of some sort. Well, you've got to be polite, so you finish that. By that time, you open the notch in your belt. But you're told this is tea. And you just finished eating, and you always wonder why the How come the Englishmen aren't fatter than they are? Why is the caricature of an Englishman that of someone who is slim, aside from that of a Colonel Blimp? It doesn't seem to match. Maybe because many Englishmen don't eat in this manner, I don't know. I think A.S. Neal should be described. At the very beginning of the interview, I think I remember saying Mr. Neal seated in his armchair. That may give him the impression of a rather comfortable flat or something. Not at all. It was a ragged chair in the middle of the room with some Sunday paper tossed about. Mr. Neal living the way he would have others live, not Spartan-like, but no favors. Just as the kids are themselves, at Summerhill he is himself. I suppose if I could come away with a picture, he's a very tall man, by the way. Rather interesting, in speaking to Lord Russell today, this is Tuesday evening, I mentioned Neil to him, who he remembered very fondly, because they have similar theories as to the education of children. Neil at 78, is a huge man, about 6'4", lumbering figure. As he walks out, he has a ragged cap on his head. And one of the little kids at Summerhill called out, "Hey, Neil." He says, "I don't know you." Apparently some sort of standing joke between them. He's referred to as Neil rather than Mr. Neil by the kids. It's not a question of lack of respect. It's just there he is. And I would come away, I think, with a picture of a man slightly embittered. No self-pity, not that at all. Neil, I think, would never feel that. But embittered, perhaps, by the fact that after 40 years of his teaching, a man who was certainly ahead of his time, he probably had thought years ago that the world might go along the way he had hoped it would, because he was teaching a freedom from fear on the part of children, being as able, or equipping them, I should say, with the ability to enjoy life, to sense that zest, and that's about it, and finding less of this than ever before in the world, and finding freedom from fear as remote as ever in the world. And I think it's the nature of the world itself that seems to have depressed him a bit. And if there is a bitterness in him, I think it's for that reason rather than for anything that has happened to him in the school, though I imagine he's not having an easy time. Men such as Neil never do, pioneers of that sort. But I think I was in the presence of a pretty great man in talking to this tall, lumbering 78-year-old Scot. There's a point that Clancy Siegel made about the accessibility of those whom you might consider gods, literary gods. He was speaking of someone he admires so much, Forster, who was there. The door is open. Now, Forster's not here in London at the moment. And so, too, in interviewing people you've read about for a long time, they're there. They're easy to see. All it requires is the making of an appointment, either directly or through some intermediary who may know them. Such is not the case with the young actor. I attempted a couple of times to interview some rising young actor in Britain, and I think the same principle applies as it would in America. It depends. I think it's done, of course, through the publicity man, as in America. But when the young actor is on the rise, he becomes property. And it probably is no fault of his that he becomes inaccessible. Because a property, the more valuable it becomes, the more it must be protected, far more than a man must be protected. And so he is wrapped in whatever it might be, cellophane or stainless steel, and so unapproachable. But in this instance, I would suggest no great loss involved. Not because the young actor isn't worth it, but because at this moment he has become so covered with coloring or armor not of his own making, really, that it's not worth the effort. But Dame Sybil Thorndike, Bertrand Russell, A.S. Neal, Ivy Compton Burnett, oh yeah. It's possible that these people might be people of this caliber available in America too, but haven't tried. The native never does, the stranger always does. Distant land somehow attempts more than the native. Narrow streets. Paris streets still have London streets beat when it comes to narrowness. The drivers, Paris drivers, I think are still wilder than London drivers, but we're waiting for Rome. We understand Roman drivers, they're the ones. Still, with the Paris drivers, you have a feeling that when he misses you, the driver, the motorist, this is a professional pedestrian now reflecting, when the driver misses you by a fraction of an inch or brushes against you and does not knock you down, you have a feeling that he is snapping his fingers with some slight frustration. Not so London drivers. I think they would be, if they knock you down, I think they would be polite and picking you up. Not that the Paris drivers wouldn't be just as gallant. It's the automobile, basically. The automobile is the equalizer. This is the one, the traffic jam in London, I am told, at certain hours is as bad as anywhere in the world. But I remember 2 years ago being in a Paris traffic jam, pretty rough. I imagine this applies to just about every city in the world where the streets have not yet been widened, and perhaps never will in some of the older cities, to meet the problem presented by the new 20th century vehicle. But the automobile, that's the one. He's it. I should say he, because I suppose he is more human sometimes than the humans who are part of the machine. I think the hours too. London is an early to bed town, it seems. I mean, there's no all-night restaurant around. Not that you ever go, you often go to an all-night restaurant in Chicago, but they close pretty early, the restaurants and clubs and theaters. And in Paris, 9 o'clock curtain. Here in many instances, 7:30 curtain. Cigarettes, that's right, can be smoked in your seat, during intermissions, or I think during the performance, I'm not sure. But there's the ashtray right in front of you, behind the seat of the man ahead of you. This was in Brighton. I'm sure this is so. I've missed theater here so far. Told there are 3 excellent works in London right now. Well, aside from Paul Schofield's King Lear and Peter Brook's direction in Stratford, there's Arnold Wesker's Chips with Everything, the 2 one-act plays of Peter Shaffer wrote the Five-Finger Exercise. This is The Private Ear and the Public Eye, the 2 one-act plays. And John Whiting, a playwright who was highly respected, his adaptation of Aldous Huxley's Devils of Loudun, a play called The Devils. And Peter Hall's direction at Aldwych of Troilus and Cressida, played upon the sand. These appear to be the productions in London of this moment worth seeing. I wish that I were good at pronouncing Welsh names, but a thought just occurred to me. This is something, I suppose, in a strange way connected with Bernowski's theory of the unity of hidden likenesses. I remember in Paris, or rather outside Paris, the town of Melun, where the prison was, the prisoners have no numbers on their cells. Their names are on their cells in this rehabilitation prison. Remember, I was much impressed with that fact. And in Wales today, the towns, in some of the towns, there are no numbers for the houses, but each house has a name. And by the way, it was a lady postman, a post lady, I should say, riding the bicycle. And it's a question of, some say maybe you're rough on her because of the lack of numbers, but I wonder if it is. I wonder if she can't remember the names better. Last night, I wish I had recorded Merritt Evans telling how names are given. So often there's so many similar names in Wales. Jones, there are probably thousands of Robert Joneses. But it's Jones, some little attribute of his becomes the name, as Dylan Thomas told us in Under Milkwood, with its Sinbad sailor, dye bread, organ Morgan, descriptions of what he does or what he looks like. There was someone who had a lot of kids, and he was called Robert Population. And then the son of so-and-so, and there was someone who said, I'm an old sage, or something like it. An old hand like me can't do much, and so they called him Jack Old Hand. And so it's using an attribute or an occupation for a man's name to differentiate him from his namesake, of which there are so many in Wales. I think there is a British feeling. I hope I'm not encouraging a stereotype, a compounding some myth, that there's a feeling for order, and somehow if you don't follow a certain rule, you get a look, and somehow walking in the train, walking through the diner at the wrong time, I think, dragging my tape recorder and a battered briefcase in one hand. It was not my imagination. I got looks. It's just a certain decorum was disturbed, you see, and the man looked up from his Daily Telegraph, The other man looked up from his Mail, and the other looked up from his Times. And each look, I think, varied according to the paper he was reading. The look of the man reading the Times seemed longer. His chin seemed longer. That is, the distance between his chin and the top of his head seemed longer than that of the man reading the Telegraph. And his, in turn, seemed longer than that of the man reading the Mail. But all three, I would say, seemed disturbed by this, not malefactor, I didn't do anything wrong, but someone disturbing a set design by walking through the diner just at that time, somehow bumping against the seats. Not really bumping, but brushing against the seats. It just isn't done, that's all. I suppose I should mention the ubiquitous Niccolo. When I met Niccolo Tucci in the lobby of the hotel where I was staying in Paris, he said, I will see you in London. Well, I didn't think he would see me in London. I thought he did leave a number. I didn't think there was much of a chance of each of us seeing the other because of the time element and work to be done. And one day I was standing, Broadcasting House is known to all Londoners. This is where BBC Sound is. And it's a huge building, very modern. Here it was. I used the office part of the time. So while waiting for a colleague of BBC to come down, there's a man behind me. And he says, well, what are you doing here? And it's Niccolo Tucci in London. So I assume if I go to Rome, the ubiquitous Mr. Tucci will be there. It reminds me of something, I can't remember what. I think it was years ago. As a kid, I read, didn't quite dig it at the time, but read it, Celine's Journey Through the End of the Night. And if I remember, there was an alter ego of this guy. His name was Robinson. I remember that much. And there was this other figure was part of him. This is not Tucci and I, but I do expect somehow to run into Tucci in Rome. Oh, I guess we must discuss, this is a subject that Americans are interested in, heating, central heating or lack of it. Some places have central heating, and this is unusual. It's something. It's a conversation piece when there is central heating. The lack of it, well, some Englishmen will say they have reasons for it, and these are the myths that are, I imagine, built up through the years that people get colds. Perhaps they're true, perhaps they're not myths. I don't know. Or they do things to your setup. But one of the reasons given for not having central heating is if you have central heating, where do you sit or what do you sit around? In short, the fireplace. Well, there's an answer to that now. The telly. So it's possible television might eventually result in central heating throughout England. because what do you sit around? The television, no longer the fireplace, you see. So one way or another, telly works in many ways its wonders to perform. British trains, they're relatively comfortable, first and second class, but you'd better get off, better know where you're getting off. No one announces where you get off. This is a lack of what service trades in the railroad line. This might be probably still as a result of the war. I don't know. It may be. But the fact is, no one tells you. You get off, for example, on the way from Wales to London, there's a stopover at Crewe. You get off at Crewe, C-R-E-W-E, and change for the London train. But no one tells you where Crewe is. You just got to be alert. You know, there is no conductor to come and say, Crewe next stop, or stuff like that. So in a way, this is good. It keeps you awake, it keeps you alert, and helps you learn about a country. No one tells you. I mean, that is, no one will volunteer anything. You've got to ask. I think this is true of for the visitor to any country. You've got to ask. So I think if anything I learned as a result of this trip, it's never to be afraid to ask. So, because my trouble is, I ask the same question about 6 different times of 6 different people, hoping that my tape recorder is working, which invariably it is not. So I must confess the real reason I ask that same question so often. Well, first of all, I want to make sure I'm going to get off at the right place, or I'm going to find the right street. And secondly, I like to hear those different accents. I get a tremendous whack out of it. And I suppose I won't do this in any American city where I am, even though I'm lost. I will ask 1 or 2 people, but here I'd like to ask everybody. And I guess the reason is that I'm still amazed at the fantastic variety of these accents to be heard in London on the subject of London, England. And perhaps one of the reasons food is eaten so quickly here, the meal is finished so quickly, might be the manner in which the fork and knife are used. Invariably, it's the fork in the left hand, the knife in the right hand, and not one is picked up and the other is put down. They're used simultaneously. The fork pretty steady, and the knife to help gather in the food, and you don't change hands in the use of the utensil. That's it. And you just pour it into you with your left hand while the sheaves are being gathered by the knife in the right. And thus this is done with a great deal of expeditiousness. And I guess the idea is to avoid too long a period of pleasure, which is eating in Paris and in Italy, in France and in Italy. The large spoon is used. This is all trivia, but nonetheless, I like it. The large spoon is used for, I was about to say desserts. It's not the word for sweet. Sweet, as you want sweet or cheese. But that's the large spoon. Little minor observations that don't mean too much, but I like to make them nonetheless.